In the autumn of 1870, a lawyer from Washington arrived at the parish courthouse in Orleans to file preliminary motions in a commercial dispute that had been dragging through the Louisiana courts for nearly 4 years. The case involved Silas Bellamy, a man whose name had once commanded respect along the stretch of warehouses between Esplanade Avenue and the turning basin of the New Orleans port. By the time the lawyer stepped off the riverboat, Bellamy was 71 years old, half blind in one eye, and burdened by debts that had quietly consumed 3 generations of family wealth. The attorney's name, recorded in the court ledger in careful copperplate script, was Josiah Mercer. He was 37 years old, spoke with the measured precision of a man who had studied law in the Eastern tradition, and carried with him a leather satchel containing correspondence, contracts, and a single document that, had anyone thought to examine it closely, would have raised questions he was not yet prepared to answer. The document was a bill of sale, dated October 17, 1852, transferring a man named Josiah Reed from the estate of Silas Bellamy to a trader identified only as H. Duval for the sum of $1. What made the document peculiar was not the price, which anyone familiar with the customs houses of antebellum Louisiana would recognize as a clerical fiction designed to obscure the true transaction. What made it peculiar was that the man carrying it bore a small, crescent-shaped scar on the webbing between the thumb and forefinger of his left hand, a scar that an old woman named Esther Reed, still living in a cramped room behind the Bellamy carriage house, had first noticed when her son was 7 years old and had cut himself on a broken window latch while trying to read by moonlight. Esther had not seen that scar in 18 years. She would see it again on a Tuesday morning in early November when a stranger in a dark wool coat crossed the courtyard of the Bellamy property to inspect the old office where her son had once copied bills of lading for a man who now needed him to argue his case before a judge. The Bellamy family had been part of the New Orleans commercial fabric since the 1820s, when Caleb Bellamy, Silas's father, purchased a narrow warehouse on Chartres Street and began trading in everything from cotton to coffee to the quiet, brutal commerce that had built the city's antebellum fortunes. Caleb was a meticulous man, given to keeping duplicate records of every transaction, a habit that his son Silas inherited but gradually corrupted as the family business expanded and the need to obscure certain transactions grew more pressing. The Bellamy property itself sat on a strip of land between the river and the old city, a 2-story brick house with iron balconies, a walled courtyard, and an outbuilding that served as both office and storage for the family's commercial papers. By 1870, the house had weathered badly. The ironwork rusted in the humid air, the courtyard tiles cracked and shifted, and the office, where 3 generations of Bellamy men had conducted their business, smelled faintly of mildew and old ink. It was into this decaying monument to a fading fortune that Josiah Mercer walked on the morning of November 8, 1870, carrying his satchel and a letter of engagement signed by Silas Bellamy himself. Silas Bellamy did not recognize him. 18 years had reshaped the boy who had once sat hunched over a copying desk in that same office, transcribing correspondence in a hand so precise that Bellamy's own clerks had resented him for it. The boy had been 19 then, slender and quiet, with the kind of watchful stillness that comes from understanding more than it is safe to reveal. The man who now stood before Bellamy was broad-shouldered, bearded, and dressed in the conservative manner of a Washington attorney. He spoke with the controlled cadence of someone accustomed to courtrooms, and when he extended his hand, Bellamy shook it without hesitation, commenting only that Mr. Mercer had come highly recommended by a firm in Baltimore. Bellamy did not look at the scar. He was too preoccupied with the stack of summonses piling up on his desk, the angry letters from creditors, and the particular embarrassment of a lawsuit filed by his own nephews, who claimed that the old man had systematically looted the family trust to maintain a lifestyle that the business could no longer support. The dispute that had finally dragged Silas Bellamy into court was, on its surface, a straightforward matter of contested inheritance and unpaid debts. But beneath the legal filings lay a far more complicated architecture of fraud that stretched back decades, involving falsified contracts, manipulated inventories, and a will whose original terms had been so thoroughly obscured that 3 different versions existed in 3 different locations, none of them agreeing with the others. Josiah Mercer knew about the will before he ever set foot in New Orleans. He had spent years collecting fragments of information from sources that Silas Bellamy had long assumed were either dead or silent, and the lawsuit provided him with the one thing he had never been able to obtain from a distance: lawful access to the private archive that Bellamy kept in the old office, a room that had remained locked to everyone except its owner since the war ended and the family's fortunes began their slow, inexorable collapse. The office was exactly as Josiah remembered it, which is to say, it was exactly as it had been on the night he was taken from it. The same mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface scarred by decades of ink spills and careless handling. The same shelves lined the walls, sagging under the weight of ledgers, letterbooks, and bundles of correspondence tied with faded ribbon. The same iron safe stood in the corner, its combination unchanged and its contents, Josiah suspected, largely intact. What had changed was the smell. In 1852, the office had smelled of tobacco, sealing wax, and the particular sweetness of good ink. In 1870, it smelled of damp plaster and something older underneath, something that reminded Josiah of the way his mother's room had smelled during the worst years, when she had stopped opening the shutters and the walls had begun to sweat in the Louisiana summer. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, his satchel still in his hand, and then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. Esther Reed was 58 years old in 1870, a woman whose body had been worn down by decades of labor, but whose mind retained the sharp, watchful quality of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest shifts of tone and posture. She had remained on the Bellamy property through the war and beyond, first because she had nowhere else to go, and later because something in her refused to leave until she understood what had actually happened to her son. Silas Bellamy had told her, in the winter of 1853, that Josiah had died of fever during the journey to Texas, and that his body had been buried somewhere along the way, in an unmarked grave that no one would ever be able to locate. He had delivered this news with the same distracted courtesy he might have used to report a lost shipment of sugar, and when Esther asked for documentation, he had promised to provide it, and then never did. In the months that followed, she had begun to notice things. A receipt for a transaction involving Josiah's labor dated 3 weeks after his supposed death. A page torn from the company ledger covering the period when the sale had occurred. A letter addressed to a man named Cross, returned unopened, with a Baltimore postmark and a date that made no sense if Josiah had died en route to Texas. Esther had saved these fragments, hiding them beneath the floorboards of her room, and in the 18 years since her son's disappearance, she had added to the collection whenever Bellamy's carelessness or the chaos of the war provided an opportunity. By the time Josiah Mercer walked into the courtyard, she had accumulated 17 documents, none of them conclusive on their own, but all of them pointing toward the same quiet, devastating truth. Her son had not died on a road in Texas. He had been sold somewhere else, under circumstances that someone had gone to considerable trouble to conceal. The recognition, when it came, was instantaneous. Esther was crossing the courtyard with a bundle of mended linens when a man in a dark coat emerged from the house and paused to examine the iron gate that led to the street. He was turned partially away from her, his left hand resting on the gate's rusted hinge, and in the angled November light, the scar between his thumb and forefinger was as visible as it had been on the day a 7-year-old boy had come to her crying, his hand wrapped in a strip of torn cloth, the blood already beginning to dry. Esther stopped walking. The linens slipped from her arms and landed in the dust at her feet, but she did not bend to retrieve them. She stood perfectly still, staring at the hand on the gate. And when the man turned to face her, she saw the rest of him, the shape of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the particular way he tilted his head when he was listening intently. It was Josiah. It was her son, older and harder, and dressed in the clothes of a profession that she had never imagined he would enter, but unmistakably hers. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he gave a slight, nearly imperceptible shake of his head. "Not here," the gesture said. "Not now." He turned away before she could speak and walked back into the house, leaving his mother standing in the courtyard with her linens on the ground and 18 years of unanswered questions burning in her throat. The explanation that Silas Bellamy gave his household for the lawyer's presence was as thin as the rest of his deceptions. Mr. Mercer, he announced, would be staying in the old office while he reviewed the family's commercial records in preparation for the upcoming trial. He was to be given full access to the archive and was not to be disturbed. Meals would be left outside the office door. The household staff, which by 1870 consisted of Esther, a cook named Margaret who had been with the family since the 1840s, and a young man named Samuel who handled the remaining horses, were instructed to treat the lawyer with the deference due to any professional guest and to answer any questions he might pose. Bellamy did not mention that the lawyer had once been a copyist in that same office, working for wages that were never paid directly to him, but instead credited against an imaginary debt that Bellamy had invented to keep him tethered to the property. He did not mention that the boy had been sold from that same office on a night when the warehouse district was quiet and the river fog was thick enough to muffle the sound of footsteps on the cobblestones. He did not mention any of this because Silas Bellamy, at 71, had spent so many years constructing a version of events in which Josiah Reed had merely been an unfortunate employee who died young, that he had genuinely begun to believe it himself. What Bellamy could not understand was why the new lawyer asked such peculiar questions. Josiah did not inquire about the pending lawsuit during his first days in the office. Instead, he requested old ledgers from the 1840s and early 50s, the ones that Bellamy had assumed were irrelevant to any current litigation. He asked about a clerk named Nathaniel Cross, who had worked for the family in the 1850s and had since retired to a small parish north of the lake. He asked about the physical layout of the office as it had existed in 1852, the placement of desks and shelves, the location of the safe, the system by which correspondence was filed. Bellamy answered these questions with increasing unease, attributing the lawyer's curiosity to thoroughness, but feeling, somewhere beneath the surface of his rational mind, the first stirrings of an old and deeply buried fear. The fear sharpened into something more concrete when Josiah asked to see the company's private ledger, the one that Bellamy kept in the iron safe, and that contained records of transactions that had never appeared in any official document. The ledger was a thick, leather-bound volume with pages that had yellowed and grown brittle over the decades, and it contained, among other things, a detailed accounting of payments made to various individuals whose names corresponded to no known creditors, suppliers, or business partners. Josiah had heard about this ledger years earlier from a man in Baltimore who had once been paid to transport a young man out of Louisiana and who had kept a receipt that mentioned the ledger by name. The receipt itself was now in Josiah's possession, one of many documents that Thomas Mercer had collected during his decades of quiet investigation into the networks that had sustained the slave trade long after the formal mechanisms of the law had supposedly constrained it. Thomas Mercer had been dead for 3 years when Josiah finally opened the box that the old abolitionist had left him. But the contents of that box had set in motion the chain of events that had brought Josiah back to New Orleans, back to the office where he had learned to read, and back to the man who had tried to erase him from the world. The box contained 47 documents, each one carefully preserved between sheets of oiled paper, each one relating in some way to the activities of Silas Bellamy and his commercial network. There were letters from traders in Baltimore, Charleston, and Mobile, discussing prices and routes and the various legal fictions employed to move people across state lines without attracting the scrutiny of authorities who might, depending on the political climate of the moment, choose to enforce the increasingly tangled web of regulations governing the internal slave trade. There were receipts for payments made to men like H. Duval, whose full name Josiah had eventually learned was Hector Duval, a French-born trader who operated between New Orleans and the eastern ports and who had died in 1861 of causes that no one had bothered to record. There were copies of contracts that referenced individuals by first name only, with no surnames and no descriptions that might allow anyone to connect the documents to actual human beings. And there was, folded into quarters and tucked inside the cover of a nautical almanac, a copy of the third will of Caleb Bellamy, the one that freed Esther Reed immediately upon his death, and that declared all of her subsequent children to be free persons, a provision that, if it had been honored, would have meant that Josiah Reed had never been anyone's property to sell. The will was the key to everything, but it was not enough on its own. Josiah needed corroboration, and the only source of corroboration was the private ledger that Silas Bellamy kept locked in the iron safe, the one that recorded the real transactions behind the fictional ones, the one that would show, among other things, the payment Bellamy had made to Hector Duval on the night Josiah was taken from the office and led down to the wharf where a ship was waiting. To obtain the ledger legally, Josiah needed to be inside the office with Bellamy's consent. To be inside the office with Bellamy's consent, he needed to be the man's lawyer. The logic was cold and clean and had required 18 years to complete its arc, and now, on a November afternoon in 1870, Josiah was sitting at the same desk where he had once copied bills of lading for a man who had never paid him, reviewing the same ledgers in which his own sale had been recorded as a $1 transaction, waiting for the moment when Bellamy would finally understand who he had allowed into his house. That understanding came, as these things often do, not through a dramatic revelation, but through a slow accumulation of small, unignorable details. Bellamy noticed first that the lawyer had stopped asking general questions about the office and had begun requesting specific documents, identifying them by date and page number with a precision that suggested prior knowledge. He noticed that Esther Reed, who had grown increasingly withdrawn over the years, had begun lingering near the office door at odd hours, as if waiting for something or someone. He noticed that the lawyer and Esther never spoke in his presence, but that when they passed each other in the courtyard, there was a charged quality to their silence, a tension that Bellamy could not name, but recognized instinctively as dangerous. And then, on the morning of November 15th, he noticed the scar. Bellamy had entered the office to retrieve a document from the safe and found Josiah seated at the desk, his left hand resting on an open ledger, his sleeve pushed back just far enough to expose the crescent-shaped mark on the webbing between his thumb and forefinger. The scar was small and faint and would have meant nothing to anyone who had not spent years watching the boy who bore it. But Silas Bellamy had watched Josiah Reed for the better part of a decade, monitoring his intelligence, his literacy, and his dangerous habit of asking questions that no one else on the property seemed to think to ask. He remembered the scar. He remembered the day the boy had gotten it, remembered Esther's frantic rush to find a physician, remembered his own irritation at the disruption. And now, 18 years later, he was looking at that same scar on the hand of his own attorney, and the pieces of a puzzle he had spent nearly 2 decades trying to forget were falling into place with a speed that left him momentarily unable to speak. Bellamy did not confront Josiah immediately. He was too calculating for that, too accustomed to maneuvering through crises by buying time and gathering information before committing to a course of action. Instead, he made a series of quiet inquiries, sending a letter to the Baltimore firm that had recommended Mr. Mercer and receiving in return a carefully worded response that confirmed the lawyer's credentials but revealed nothing about his background. He searched the office for anything that might tell him who Josiah Mercer really was and found nothing, because Josiah had been careful to remove from his personal effects anything that might connect him to the boy who had once been called Josiah Reed. And then, in desperation, Bellamy turned to the one person who might know the truth, but who was also the one person he least wanted to ask. He summoned Esther Reed to the house on the evening of November 20th, 1870, and asked her, with the false casualness of a man who was trying very hard to seem unconcerned, whether the new lawyer reminded her of anyone. Esther, who had been waiting for this question for nearly 3 weeks and had rehearsed her answer 100 times, replied that she had not noticed anything in particular. Bellamy pressed further, asking specifically about the scar on the lawyer's hand, and Esther met his gaze with the same flat, unreadable expression she had cultivated in the years after her son's disappearance, the expression of a woman who had learned that revealing anything to this man would only give him another weapon to use against her. She said she had seen many scars on many hands over the years and could not be expected to remember them all. Bellamy dismissed her with a curt nod, but as she turned to leave, he called her back and asked one more question. He asked if she had ever received any confirmation of her son's death, any document or letter or witness who could verify what had happened to him on the road to Texas. Esther stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling the weight of the 17 documents hidden beneath the floorboards of her room, each one a small, silent testament to the lie that had shaped her life. She said no. She said she had received nothing. And then she walked out into the courtyard, where the November fog was beginning to gather, and she looked toward the office window, where a lamp was burning, and her son, under a name that was not his own, was reading through the records of his own destruction. The days that followed were marked by a strange, suspended quality, as if the Bellamy property had entered a pocket of time that moved at a different speed than the world outside its walls. Josiah continued his work in the office, methodically photographing pages of the private ledger with a small camera he had brought from Washington, a device that Bellamy did not know existed, and that allowed Josiah to create a duplicate set of records without removing anything from the premises. Esther continued her daily routines, cooking and cleaning and mending, but she began to leave small signals for her son that only he would recognize. A particular arrangement of stones along the courtyard path, a cloth tied to the gate in a way that indicated whether Bellamy was in the house or had gone into the city. Margaret, the cook, noticed these signals, but said nothing. She had been on the property long enough to understand that some things were better left unacknowledged. Samuel, the young man who tended the horses, noticed only that the lawyer worked late into the night. that the lamp in the office window was often still burning when the rest of the house had gone dark, and that the old man Bellamy had begun to drink more heavily than usual, sitting alone in the parlour with a glass of whiskey and staring at nothing. The tension finally broke on the night of November 24th, when Bellamy entered the office without knocking and found Josiah examining a document that he had no legitimate reason to possess. The document was the copy of Caleb Bellamy's third will, the one that Josiah had carried with him from Baltimore, the one that freed Esther Reed and all of her children from the moment of Caleb's death. Bellamy recognized it instantly because he had spent 30 years trying to ensure that no one would ever see it again. He had paid Nathaniel Cross to falsify the version that had been submitted to the probate court. He had burned the original that his father had signed in the presence of 2 witnesses, and he had assumed that the only remaining copy had been destroyed when the office in which it was kept was damaged by fire in 1863. He had been wrong, and now the proof of his wrongness was in the hands of a man whose face, in the lamplight, had begun to look increasingly familiar. Bellamy demanded to know where Josiah had obtained the document. Josiah did not answer. He continued to read, his expression calm and almost bored, as if he had been expecting this confrontation and had already determined its outcome. Bellamy's voice rose, and then his hand moved toward the document, and then, in a moment that neither man would ever describe in detail to anyone else, Josiah looked up and met Bellamy's eyes with a gaze that contained 18 years of patient, methodical rage. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten or accuse. He simply asked, in the same measured tone he used in courtrooms, whether Mr. Bellamy remembered a young man who had worked in this office in the autumn of 1852, a copyist with good handwriting and a habit of asking questions about the documents he transcribed. Bellamy's face went grey. He stepped backward, his hand falling away from the will, and for the first time since the lawyer had arrived, he understood exactly who was sitting at his desk. The confrontation that Bellamy had prepared for did not come. Josiah did not reveal himself, did not demand justice, did not even acknowledge the recognition that had passed between them. He simply returned his attention to the document and continued working as if Bellamy were not there, as if the revelation that had just occurred was merely another piece of evidence to be filed and catalogued and used at the appropriate moment. Bellamy retreated to the house, where he spent the rest of the night pacing the parlour and drinking whiskey and trying to calculate how much damage a man with access to his private records could do if he chose to. The answer, he concluded with increasing panic, was catastrophic. The next morning, Bellamy attempted to dismiss his attorney. He drafted a letter terminating the engagement, citing irreconcilable differences of legal strategy, and he ordered one of the remaining servants to deliver it to the office, but Josiah had anticipated this move as well. Before receiving the letter, he had already filed with the court a notice of his involvement in the case, attaching copies of several documents that he had obtained from the Bellamy archive and that were now, by virtue of their submission, part of the public record. Dismissing him at that stage would require explanation, and any explanation Bellamy might offer would inevitably expose the very secrets he was trying to protect. The letter of dismissal was never delivered. Instead, Bellamy began a quieter campaign, removing documents from the office when he thought Josiah was not present, burning papers in the courtyard fireplace, and instructing Margaret to restrict the lawyer's access to the house itself. But the damage, from Bellamy's perspective, had already been done. The private ledger had been photographed, the will had been preserved, and somewhere in the quiet, fog-shrouded courtyard of the Bellamy property, Esther Reed was waiting with 17 fragments of evidence that, taken together, told a story that Silas Bellamy had spent nearly half his life trying to bury. What Esther Reed had guarded for 18 years was not an organized archive. but a collection of fragments that only a grieving mother would know how to recognize as evidence. The first document, obtained in January of 1853, was a provisioning receipt issued by a trader from Mobile, dated October 28, 1852, 11 days after the alleged sale of Josiah. The receipt mentioned provisions for a group of 7 people in transit, including a young man described as a copyist, and bore in the lower right corner an annotation in different ink. J. 19 can read. Esther had found the paper inside a ledger book that Bellamy had discarded during a reorganization of the office, and its presence there directly contradicted the claim that Josiah had perished during the journey to Texas. If he had died on the way, how to explain a receipt from Mobile dated nearly 2 weeks after the departure, describing someone who matched his profile exactly? The second document was more disturbing. It was a page torn from the main accounting ledger, corresponding to the period between October and November of 1852. The page had been carefully removed, cut flush against the binding, but whoever had torn it out had made a mistake. They had forgotten to eliminate the following page, which contained references to transactions initiated during the missing period. Esther had found the torn page inside a box of old correspondence that Bellamy had ordered burned in the backyard, but which Margaret, the cook, had partially rescued, believing the wooden boxes could be repurposed. Margaret had handed the papers to Esther without examining them, and Esther had spent 3 nights reconstructing what she could from the singed fragments. In the margin of one scrap of paper, legible only under strong light, there was an annotation. H. Duval, Baltimore, October 1st, price adjusted. The third fragment was the most enigmatic. In 1854, nearly 2 years after Josiah's disappearance, a letter arrived at the Bellamy property addressed to a certain Nathaniel Cross, sent from Baltimore and returned by the postal service with the notation addressee unknown. Esther was present when the letter arrived and watched Bellamy turn pale upon recognizing the name of the sender. T. Mercer, Law Office, Church Street, Baltimore. Bellamy had slipped the letter into his coat pocket and never mentioned the matter again. But Esther had mentally noted every detail of the envelope before it disappeared. 12 years later, when the war had ended and the Bellamy property was in frank decline, she had found the same letter, still sealed, inside a locked drawer that Bellamy had forgotten to empty during a hasty rearrangement of furniture. The letter remained sealed for another 6 years, until the night when Esther, now 58 years old and convinced that her son was alive, decided to open it with a kitchen knife and discover what Thomas Mercer had wanted to communicate to Nathaniel Cross 18 years earlier. The letter, dated March 3rd, 1854, was brief and elliptical, composed in the cautious tone of someone who knew that correspondence of this kind was frequently intercepted. Mercer informed Cross that a young man described as J. Reed, previously residing in New Orleans, had arrived in Baltimore under circumstances that raised questions about the legality of his transfer. Mercer asked whether Cross, in his capacity as the clerk responsible for the Bellamy property records, could provide information regarding the will of Caleb Bellamy and the provisions concerning the household workers. The letter ended with a phrase that Esther read 7 times before fully understanding its meaning. The young man in question is now under my protection and instruction, and any documents you may be able to provide will contribute to the restitution of rights that, according to preliminary evidence, were taken from him by fraudulent means. It was this phrase that kept Esther alive during the hardest years, the years between the end of the war and the arrival of the lawyer from Washington. She did not know if Josiah was well. She did not know if he remembered her. She did not know if she would ever see him again. But she knew, with the certainty that only a mother could possess, that her son had not died on a Texas road. He was in Baltimore under the protection of a lawyer named Thomas Mercer, and someone had tried to prevent Nathaniel Cross from learning of this. The fact that the letter had been returned meant that Cross had never received it, and the fact that Bellamy had kept it rather than destroying it meant that he considered it dangerous enough to keep close, like a weapon that might be needed in the future. The other 14 documents were less spectacular, but equally revealing when examined together. There was an inventory list from 1853 that mentioned copyists' tools among the property's assets, although the copyist had supposedly already died. There was a payment record to a physician who had treated Esther for a fever in 1855, with a marginal note that read, "Mother of the missing copyist," suggesting that even the property's staff did not accept the official version of the death. There was a rudimentary map of the river routes between New Orleans and Baltimore, folded inside a navigation catalogue, with the city of Baltimore circled in red ink and the notation TM beside it. And there was, finally, a small black-covered notebook that Esther had found in 1867, 3 years before Josiah's return, during a cleaning of the main house attic. The notebook contained annotations in Silas Bellamy's own handwriting, listing names, dates, values, and destinations of people who had passed through the property between 1845 and 1852. Josiah Reed's name appeared on the penultimate page, accompanied by the annotation "knows too much" and the date of October 17th, 1852. When Josiah finally examined these documents, in the quiet of the office lit only by the oil lamp, he did so with the same meticulousness with which he analyzed commercial contracts. There were no tears, no embraces, no emotional explosion that Esther had secretly expected from the moment she had recognized him in the courtyard. There was only silence and questions, and the unsettling sensation that the son she had recovered was not the boy she had lost, but a stranger who wore another man's name and treated his own story as if it were a judicial process still awaiting sentence. Esther told Josiah everything she knew, everything she remembered, everything she suspected. She spoke of the night of the sale, when Bellamy had summoned her to the main house and told her, with the cold courtesy he reserved for his most elaborate lies, that Josiah would be transferred to a property in Texas where his skills as a copyist would be better utilized. She spoke of the months that followed, when every inquiry about her son's whereabouts was met with evasions, then with irritation, then with the news of a death that no one could confirm. She spoke of Nathaniel Cross, the clerk who had vanished from the property a few weeks after Josiah, dismissed for reasons Bellamy never explained. She spoke of the years of silence, the war, the decay of the house, the feeling of growing old in a place that was not hers, surrounded by the evidence of a crime that no one wanted to investigate. And then, when she finished, she asked the question that had tormented her from the moment she had seen her son cross the courtyard for the first time. Why had he agreed to defend the man who had sold him? Josiah did not answer immediately. He remained seated in silence, his hands resting on the documents his mother had guarded for nearly 2 decades, and when he finally spoke, his voice had the flat, controlled quality of someone who had rehearsed this explanation for a very long time. He was not there to defend Silas Bellamy, he said. He was there to access the family's private archive, an archive that no court would have the authority to search without a specific legal cause. The litigation between Bellamy and his business partners was the cause, and the legal representation was the access. He did not intend to win the case for Bellamy. He intended to use the case as a vehicle to introduce into the judicial record the documents that would prove the fraud of the will, and by extension, the illegality of his own sale. Every step had been calculated, every move anticipated, every risk assessed. The only variable he had been unable to control was the reunion with his mother, and for that reason he had chosen silence during the first weeks, fearing that any demonstration of recognition would alert Bellamy before the evidence was secure. Esther heard everything in silence, her hands folded on her lap, her eyes fixed on the son who spoke like a lawyer, not like a son. She understood the logic, respected the strategy, admired the patience. But there was something in Josiah's coldness that unsettled her, a distance that was not merely professional, but existential. The boy she had raised had been curious, affectionate, incapable of hiding what he felt. The man before her seemed to have spent 18 years learning precisely the opposite. What Josiah did not tell Esther that night, and what she would only understand weeks later, was that his investigation went far beyond proving his own freedom. What he was truly seeking in Bellamy's archives was a pattern, a recurrence, the confirmation of a suspicion that Thomas Mercer had nurtured for decades and that Josiah had inherited along with the box of documents, that Silas Bellamy was not an isolated case of testamentary fraud, but part of a network of traders who systematically altered, forged, or suppressed wills and manumission documents to keep people in bondage long after their freedom had been legally established. Josiah's case was only one among dozens, perhaps hundreds, and the accounting ledger that Bellamy kept in the iron safe contained the names, the dates, and the sums that could prove the existence of this network. That was why Josiah spent the first fortnight of December 1870 working 18 hours a day, photographing page after page of the internal ledger, cross-referencing names with the public records of the probate court, noting discrepancies, inconsistencies, gaps that no legitimate accounting could explain. The ledger revealed that Bellamy maintained two parallel accounting systems, an official one, recorded in the tax books submitted to the authorities, and an unofficial one, which documented the actual transactions. In the official system, Josiah appeared as an employee who received housing and food in exchange for labor. In the unofficial system, he appeared as an asset transferred to Hector Duval for $850, a sum that had never been declared to any authority and that Bellamy had pocketed in full. There were other names in the book, 23 in total, each accompanied by a transfer date, a sum received, and a destination that, in almost every case, was fictitious. 9 names bore the notation Texas beside them, the same destination Bellamy had claimed for Josiah. 7 had Mobile, 4 had Charleston, 3 had only a question mark, as though Bellamy himself did not know or did not care where those people had been taken. In every case except Josiah's, there was no indication of what had happened after the transfer. 23 lives reduced to lines in an accounting ledger, filed alongside records of coffee purchases and bales of cotton, as if the difference between one commodity and another was merely a matter of terminology. The most disturbing discovery, however, lay not in the names, but in the dates. By cross-referencing the records of the unofficial ledger with the wills filed in the probate court, Josiah identified a pattern that repeated itself with almost mathematical precision. Whenever a property owner's will established conditions for the liberation of enslaved people, the heirs would turn to Bellamy or to intermediaries associated with him to conduct private sales before the will could be executed. The sales were always documented incompletely, with fictitious prices, false destinations, and witnesses who, when verified, were dead, missing, or had never existed at all. The objective was simple: to transfer the people far from the court's jurisdiction before anyone could challenge the validity of the transaction. Once out of state, the buyers could resell them with new documents, erasing any trace that might lead back to the original estate. Nathaniel Cross, the former clerk, confirmed the scheme when Josiah finally located him in mid-December, living in a modest house on the shores of Lake Pontchartrain, 10 miles north of the city. Cross was 64 years old, with arthritis that had deformed his hands and a conscience that, according to his own words, had not allowed him to sleep since 1852. He confessed everything: the forgery of Caleb Bellamy's will, the substitution of the pages, the bribery of the witnesses, the destruction of the original document. He said that Silas Bellamy had approached him a few weeks after his father's death, in May of 1849, with a simple proposition. Cross would receive $200 to prepare a new version of the will, a version that would eliminate all provisions for freedom and transfer full control of the assets to Silas. Cross had accepted because he was in debt, because he feared losing his job, because he believed no one would ever find out. And for 3 years, no one did. What Cross did not know, and what he only confessed when Josiah pressed him with increasingly specific questions, was that the forgery of Caleb's will had not been an isolated act. Bellamy maintained a commercial relationship with at least 4 other notaries and clerks in New Orleans, Mobile, and Baton Rouge, all willing to produce false documents in exchange for a percentage of the profits from the sales. Cross provided names, addresses, approximate dates, and, most importantly, the location of a second accounting ledger that Bellamy kept hidden away from the main property in a rented warehouse in the Algiers neighborhood on the other side of the Mississippi River. The revelation of the second ledger completely altered the scope of Josiah's investigation. What he had found in the Bellamy property office was merely the tip of a documentary iceberg that spanned 3 decades and involved dozens, perhaps hundreds, of fraudulent transactions. The second ledger, according to Cross, contained the records of sales conducted on behalf of third parties, the settlements with notaries, the bribes to public officials, and most importantly, the complete list of people transferred through the network, with names, ages, origins, and the true names of the final buyers. But the Algiers warehouse presented a problem. To access it, Josiah would need a court order. And to obtain a court order, he would need to reveal to the court at least part of what he had already discovered, which would inevitably alert Bellamy and his accomplices before all the evidence could be gathered. There was also the question of the statute of limitations. Many of the crimes documented in the ledgers dated from the decades of the 1840s and 50s, and even if they were proven, the victims would already be dead or dispersed, and those responsible, protected by time and by the deliberate destruction of complementary records. It was at this point that Josiah made the decision that would define the rest of the case, and in a sense, the rest of his life. Rather than pursuing a comprehensive criminal indictment, he would concentrate his efforts on 2 specific and legally viable objectives. First, to obtain judicial recognition that he had been born free, retroactively invalidating the sale of 1852. Second, to use the evidence of testamentary fraud to annul the property transfers that Bellamy had conducted based on the false will, allowing the legitimate creditors and heirs to recover part of the diverted estate. It was a limited strategy, one that left the greater crimes unpunished. But it was the only one with any chance of success within the existing legal system. What Josiah had not foreseen, and what nearly destroyed his entire plan, was Bellamy's reaction when he finally understood that his lawyer was not there to defend him. The crisis erupted in the second week of January 1871, when Bellamy, increasingly suspicious, decided to personally search the office while Josiah was away at a preliminary hearing at the parish court. What he found was a leather folder that Josiah had forgotten to lock in the portable safe he kept under his bed. Inside the folder was a copy of Caleb Bellamy's will, detailed notes on the discrepancies in the accounting ledgers, and, most damningly, A draft of the petition Josiah intended to submit to the court, requesting recognition of his status as a free man from birth. The petition named Silas Bellamy directly, described the fraudulent sale, and cited the company's internal ledger as evidence. Bellamy read the petition 3 times, his understanding oscillating between disbelief and panic. Then he did what any man who had dedicated his life to hiding the truth would do upon discovering that his lawyer was the very person he had tried to erase. He attempted to destroy everything. He ordered Margaret to light the fireplace in the main house, despite the January heat, and began transporting piles of documents from the office to the living room, throwing them into the flames without examining their contents. Margaret, feigning compliance, managed to rescue several bundles of papers before they were consumed, hiding them in the woodshed out back. Samuel, the young man who tended the horses, was sent to the Algiers warehouse with instructions to collect the second accounting ledger and deliver it personally to Bellamy, but on the way he encountered Esther, who intercepted him with a story about a loose animal on the road and convinced him to turn back before completing the mission. Neither of them knew exactly what they were protecting, but both understood, with the instinct of those who had lived for decades on that property, that something fundamental was changing and that the old man Bellamy should not be helped. When Josiah returned from the court that night, he found the office partially empty, the fireplace in the house still warm, and Bellamy seated in the armchair of the living room, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a revolver in the other. The revolver was unloaded, as Josiah would later discover, but Bellamy did not know this, or pretended not to know, and spent the following hour alternating between pleas, threats, and partial confessions that never assumed real responsibility for anything. Bellamy said that Josiah had always been the best copyist the property had ever had. He said he would have kept the young man close if not for the cursed will of his father, a document that Caleb had drafted on his deathbed, influenced by ideas that did not apply to the real world of business. He said that the sale to Duval had been a mistake, a decision made under pressure, and that he had spent the last 18 years trying to forget what he had done. He said that he had secretly financed Josiah's education in Baltimore, sending money to Thomas Mercer through intermediaries, and that the young man's return as a lawyer was, in a sense, the result of his own investment. Josiah listened to all of it in silence, standing by the door of the room, his hands in the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable. When Bellamy finished, he asked only 2 things: whether Bellamy had proof of the financing he claimed to have sent to Baltimore, and whether he remembered the names of the other 23 people he had sold using the same method. Bellamy answered neither question. Instead, he raised the unloaded revolver and aimed it in Josiah's direction, his hand trembling, the gaze of a man who had already lost everything and had not yet realized it. Josiah did not retreat. He merely said that the revolver, an old percussion model, would not fire if the hammer was in the locked position, and that Bellamy would do better to put it away before someone was accidentally hurt. Then he turned his back and left the room, leaving the old man alone with his bottle and his useless weapon, and the belated understanding that the boy he had sold for $850 had returned to dismantle everything he had built. The following morning, Josiah formally submitted his resignation from the case. The notification was filed at the Orleans Parish Court at 9:47 in the morning on January 16, 1871. Accompanied by a statement that did not explain the reasons for the resignation, but also did not hide them. The statement informed the judge that the attorney Josiah Mercer had discovered, in the course of his representation, evidence that the defendant, Silas Bellamy, had been involved in acts that, if proven, could constitute testamentary fraud, document forgery, and the illegal sale of free persons, and that such evidence would be submitted to the court through independent channels, in accordance with the ethical obligations of the profession. The resignation provoked immediate chaos in Silas Bellamy's already fragile world. The former business partners, who had been losing ground in the litigation, seized upon the statement to request a full investigation of the family's financial records. The creditors, who until then had been negotiating patiently, demanded the immediate settlement of the debts. The nephews who had initiated the original lawsuit hired a new attorney, a man named Reginald Thorne from Baton Rouge, known for his aggressiveness in inheritance disputes and his willingness to expose family scandals in open court. In less than a week, the Bellamy case ceased to be a routine commercial dispute and transformed into one of the most talked-about scandals in New Orleans, attracting the attention of newspapers, the curious, and, inevitably, other lawyers who sniffed out the opportunity to extract fees from a collapsing estate. But the hardest blow for Bellamy did not come from the court, but rather from the public revelation of his relationship with Josiah. Someone, probably one of the court clerks, leaked to the local newspaper the information that the lawyer who had resigned from the case was, in truth, the son of a woman who had worked on the Bellamy property and who had been sold by the defendant himself 18 years earlier. The story was too good to ignore, and within a few days it circulated throughout the city, narrated in different versions that varied in detail, but agreed on the essential. A man sold in his youth had returned to destroy the one who sold him, using the weapons of the law instead of the weapons of violence. The New Orleans Crescent newspaper published, in its edition of January 22, 1871, an article titled "The Lawyer's Return," which recounted the story with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. The article mentioned Esther Reed as a mother who had waited 18 years for her son's return, described Josiah Mercer as a Washington lawyer whose professional competence contrasted with the mystery of his intentions, and portrayed Silas Bellamy as an old merchant whose past had finally caught up with him. The tone of the article was ambivalent. While condemning the sale of Josiah as an abominable act, it also insinuated that the lawyer was perhaps motivated by revenge rather than justice, and questioned whether a man who had hidden his identity to infiltrate the defense of his own tormentor could be considered ethically fit to practice law. Josiah did not respond to the article. He did not respond to any of the articles that followed, nor to the letters that began arriving from across Louisiana, some offering support, others threatening violence, most expressing a morbid curiosity he had no interest in satisfying. He continued working, now in a rented office in the city center, preparing the documentation he would submit to the court in the weeks ahead. Esther moved from the Bellamy property to a rented room on the same street, and mother and son began seeing each other daily, though their conversations remained strangely formal, as if both were still adjusting to the idea that the reunion was real and permanent. It was during this period, between late January and early February of 1871, that Josiah managed to locate and recover the second accounting ledger from the Algiers warehouse. The operation was conducted with the help of a court officer named Marcus Webb, a man of 43 who had worked at the parish court for 2 decades and who harbored a quiet contempt for merchants like Bellamy. Webb obtained a court order to inspect the warehouse based on an anonymous report that the location stored undeclared goods, and during the inspection he found a locked iron box that contained not only the second accounting ledger, but also a collection of original wills, letters from buyers, and payment receipts that Bellamy had accumulated over 30 years of operations. The iron box was, in essence, an insurance policy against betrayal. Bellamy had kept all the documents that could incriminate his accomplices, ensuring that, if ever accused, he could drag down with him an entire network of merchants, notaries, and public officials. What he had not foreseen was that his own records would be used against him by someone who had nothing to negotiate. The contents of the second ledger were even more revealing than Josiah had expected. Beyond the 23 names he had already identified in the first ledger, The second contained another 114 records of transfers carried out between 1845 and 1861, covering people of all ages and origins, many of them clearly described as free or entitled to freedom, in documents that Bellamy had simply ignored. There were also records of payments to judges, sheriffs, and customs officials, bribes that ensured the illegal transfers were not questioned. And there was, finally, a section dedicated exclusively to Hector Duval, the trader who had transported Josiah to Baltimore, with detailed annotations about the routes, the intermediate ports, the false documents used, and the final buyers. It was in this section that Josiah found something he had not expected. A letter from Duval to Bellamy, dated November 5, 1852, 19 days after the sale, in which the trader reported that the young Josiah Reed had been resold in Baltimore to a lawyer named Thomas Mercer, who had alleged irregularities in the transfer documents and threatened to take the matter to the authorities. The letter ended with a phrase that explained why Bellamy had never attempted to recover Josiah. "Mercer is dangerous," it said. "He knows the laws better than we do. I suggest forgetting the boy and moving on." Bellamy had followed the advice. He had invented the story of the death in Texas, destroyed the records of the original sale, and spent 18 years pretending that Josiah Reed had never existed. But Duval's letter had remained in the archive, forgotten among hundreds of other documents, waiting for the day when someone would find it and read it and understand that the lie had a date, a place, and an author. The main hearing of the case took place in March of 1871, in a courtroom packed with the curious journalists and relatives of the people whose names appeared in the accounting ledgers. Josiah, now acting as both witness and petitioner in his own cause, presented the judge with a selection of documents that proved three facts: that Caleb Bellamy's original will had granted him freedom from birth, that the sale carried out by Silas Bellamy had been illegal and fraudulent, and that Bellamy had operated for decades a systematic scheme of document forgery designed to deprive dozens of people of their legally established freedom. The judge, a man named Henry Thornton, age 67, listened to the arguments with an indecipherable expression. Born in Virginia and educated at Harvard, Thornton belonged to a generation of jurists still digesting the transformations imposed by the war and abolition, and his record in cases involving former enslavers was ambivalent. Sometimes he favored the plaintiffs, sometimes he protected the defendants, depending on how solid the evidence was and how much public pressure surrounded the case. But the evidence presented by Josiah was incontestable. The original will of Caleb Bellamy, though damaged by time, bore signatures that experts confirmed to be authentic. The unofficial accounting ledger showed, in Silas Bellamy's own handwriting, the sale of Josiah for $850. Hector Duval's letter confirmed the transfer to Baltimore and Thomas Mercer's intervention. And the testimony of Nathaniel Cross, delivered in open court, detailed the forgery of the will and the destruction of the original document. Bellamy, seated in the defendant's chair, contested none of the evidence. His substitute attorney, a man named George Whitfield, hired in haste after Josiah's resignation, attempted to argue that the crimes had expired under the statute of limitations, that the witnesses were biased, that the documents could have been altered. But Judge Thornton, after examining the original will with his own hands, declared that the evidence was conclusive, and that Josiah Mercer's status as a free man from birth was judicially established. The sentence was delivered on March 23, 1871, Josiah Reed Mercer was declared free from the moment of his birth on April 11th, 1833, and the sale carried out on October 17th, 1852 was declared null and fraudulent. Silas Bellamy was ordered to pay symbolic damages of $1, the same amount he had recorded on the bill of sale 18 years earlier, but the financial consequences of the sentence went far beyond that. The annulment of the false will invalidated all the property transfers that Bellamy had conducted based upon it, opening the way for creditors and legitimate heirs to claim the family's assets. In less than 6 months, Bellamy lost the warehouse, the house, the investments, and even the furniture that decorated the room where he had received Josiah as his lawyer. But the sentence was also, in a sense, a partial defeat. Judge Thornton refused to extend the investigation to the other 114 names in the second accounting ledger, arguing that the court lacked jurisdiction over cases involving transactions conducted outside Louisiana, and that many of the people mentioned would already be dead or impossible to locate. Thornton also rejected Josiah's attempt to criminally prosecute Bellamy for forgery, citing the statute of limitations and the difficulty of obtaining complementary evidence so many years after the facts. The fraud had been proven, but the punishment would be civil, not criminal. And so, in the end, Silas Bellamy was not imprisoned. He lost everything he possessed, but he did not lose his freedom. He died in November of 1871, 8 months after the sentence, in a rented room of a modest boarding house on Dauphine Street, attended only by a landlady who had found him collapsed in the hallway and called a doctor too late. Until the final moment, according to the landlady, he repeated that he had never sold Josiah, that he had only sent him away to protect the family, and that his father's will was an old man's fantasy, a document that Caleb had signed without understanding the consequences. He died alone, with none of his family visiting him, and was buried in a public cemetery whose burial record omitted his full name, as though even death was ashamed to claim him. Josiah did not attend the burial. He spent the following months working to organize the recovered documents, attempting to identify the people whose names appeared in the accounting ledgers and, where possible, to locate their descendants. The task was monumental and, in large part, impossible. Many of the names were incomplete, many of the destinations were fictitious, and most of the people transferred through Bellamy's network had simply disappeared into the recesses of a system designed to make them untraceable. Josiah managed to locate 3 descendants, 2 in Mobile and 1 in Baton Rouge, and gave them copies of the documents proving their ancestors' freedom, though he knew the gesture was more symbolic than practical. None of them could claim properties or compensation. The justice Josiah offered them was only the justice of recognition, the belated validation that their relatives should not have been sold, should not have been erased, should not have been forgotten. Esther Reed lived another 11 years after the trial. She moved to Baltimore in 1872 at Josiah's invitation and spent her final years in a modest house her son had purchased with part of the fees accumulated during his career in Washington. The relationship between mother and son remained until the end, marked by a distance that neither knew how to bridge. Esther never again asked why Josiah had spent weeks under the same roof as Bellamy without revealing his identity, and Josiah never offered an explanation beyond the one he had already recorded in the judicial record, that he had wanted to know whether the man would confess when he believed himself protected by his own lawyer. Bellamy had never confessed, and that absence of confession seemed to echo between mother and son, like a question that could not be answered. Margaret, the cook who had helped Esther preserve the documents during the dark years, remained on the Bellamy property until the creditors evicted her, then worked in a laundry in the Tremont C neighborhood, and died in 1879 at 61 years of age, of a pneumonia the doctor attributed to years of accumulated dampness in her lungs. Samuel, the young man who tended the horses, left New Orleans after the trial and was never seen in the city again. Nathaniel Cross, the clerk who had confessed to the forgery, died in 1873, 3 months after signing a statement detailing his role in Bellamy's scheme, a statement that Josiah attached to the judicial file as supplementary evidence. In 1874, 3 years after the trial, a fire destroyed part of the Orleans Parish Court archive, damaging several documents related to the Bellamy case. The accounting ledgers, which Josiah had left in judicial custody, were partially burned, and the surviving pages were transferred to a secondary storage facility where, according to an inventory from 1902, they were misplaced during a building renovation. The original will of Caleb Bellamy, however, was preserved. Josiah had requested and obtained permission to keep a certified copy, and the copy remained in his personal archive until his death. Josiah Mercer continued practicing law in Washington for another 28 years, specializing in commercial disputes and cases of document fraud. He never married, never had children, and rarely spoke of his past. Professional colleagues described him as a competent, reserved, and occasionally relentless man, someone who treated each case as though it were personal, even when the sums involved were insignificant. Few knew his true story, and those who knew learned not to ask. He died on February 8, 1902, at 68 years of age, of causes his doctor described as general organ failure, a vague phrase that could mean anything. In the will he left behind, he directed that all his personal documents be donated to the law library of the university that had welcomed him decades earlier, with the condition that they remain sealed for 50 years after his death. The condition was respected. In 1952, exactly 50 years later, the library opened the boxes. Inside them, in addition to the documents of the Bellamy case, there was a list of 23 names, written in tiny handwriting and dated 1852. Beside each name, a date, a fictitious price, a destination that never existed. Josiah had recognized only his own. The other 22 names were never identified. The list was catalogued as a historical document and filed in a section of the library that few visited, waiting perhaps for the day when someone would find it and read it and understand that those names were not footnotes but lives. The last document in the box was a letter Josiah had written in 1898, 4 years before his death, and which he had never sent to anyone. The letter had no declared recipient and consisted of a single sentence, written in the center of a sheet of paper that time had yellowed and made brittle. It said only, "I asked myself for 46 years whether his silence was fear or conviction, and I still do not know the answer." The letter was not included in the official inventory of the donation. A library employee found it loose inside one of the boxes in 1963 and classified it as a personal document of no historical value, attaching it to a folder of uncatalogued materials that, in 1971, was transferred to a secondary storage facility and, from there, to a municipal archive that no one had consulted in decades. What happened to the letter after that was never recorded. Perhaps it is still somewhere, waiting. Perhaps it was destroyed, like so many other documents that told stories no one wanted to hear. What survived, however, was the list of 23 names, preserved in the law library as silent testimony that the story of Josiah Reed Mercer had not been an exception, an anomaly, an isolated case of injustice corrected by time and individual perseverance. It had been merely the only fraud that someone had managed to return to prove.